Over the years, I've heard the same issues from landlords across the board that were totally avoidable issues. And so I've compiled 5 common mistakes that landlords make when renting real estate. Mostly this applies to residential, though it could apply to commercial. Residential is just a little trickier with a lot more tenant rights. So I'm going to get right into it. The first one is don't do any favors with real estate. If you have real estate, you know that it is extremely hard to get. It is quite an accomplishment to own real estate. And a lot of the times you know, people have an inclination to be good-spirited or good-willed. So people will often, have friends or family that are in a bind and need to rent a place or need somewhere to live. The issue with that is when you do a favor, once you move someone in and you start collecting rent money, they're a tenant. It's no longer a favor, it's now an obligation you have to this person or these people. Doing a favor doesn't, by nature means you're doing something without any expectation of anything in return. Well, when you let someone live in your apartment or live in your house, there's now an obligation for you to adhere to the laws that revolve around being a landlord. So even if you didn't want to be one, you are now one. And so the common mistake that people have is that they do this favor and then down the line they think, okay, this person will pay me back in some way. They will move out when they need to move out. They will look for a job and try to get themselves back on their feet. A lot of the times these favors end up enabling people to not help themselves. Now, have favors help people? Of course, but you don't do a favor with the expectation of anything in return. And oftentimes landlords have this expectation of something in return, usually in the form of cooperation and the person moving when it's most beneficial for the landlord, not the tenant, or the person you're doing the favor for, which becomes a tenant. So the next one is don't lease your apartments, your houses for less than market rent at the outset. Now, market conditions change. So, for instance, there's been somewhat of a correction in some areas for rents. Rents have gone down a little bit, especially with multifamily. So in that case, you rent at what the market is demanding. If you don't know, you can do a quick Zillow search or a Craigslist search, some sort of online search in your area, and you'll figure out what rents are going for. What I'm talking about is, an apartment, maybe market rent is $2,000 and you lease it for $1,600, $1,500. Again, this usually comes in the form of doing someone a favor. There could be another reason. I don't know, like maybe it's a good applicant and you really want to get them, and maybe as part of the negotiation, they demand like a much lower rent than market. Don't do it. Market rent is market rent. Now, if you want to do it for some altruistic reason, that's on you. But what ends up happening is when you don't lease it at market rent, down the line, when you go and do rent increases, you're going to be that much further behind. And then many landlords, present day, leased the apartments way too cheap at the outset. And so it sets them back as a landlord. Then landlords get really pissed off that, well, the tenant's paying really, really below market. Well, to begin with, you didn't go with market. That's why it's market rent. Another thing is nothing is truly short-term or temporary. So this kind of piggies back on the don't do favors. Usually this happens where someone either doesn't have really good credit, they're a friend or family member that can't get an apartment on their own, that their application gets rejected. But they go, it's temporary, and then I'm going to move out. It's temporary. I just need a place until I get back on my feet. You hope it's temporary. They probably hope it's temporary, but a lot of the times it's not. So if you put someone in your building, expect it that they are going to be a long-term tenant. And this is really crucial when you move someone into a rent-controlled building. So if you move them in, they're protected. Even if it's a favor, even if they're family, even if they're a friend, even if they swear that it is going to be temporary and they're going to move out, in 3 months or whatever, don't expect it to be temporary. and it rarely is short term and it's rarely temporary. I have so many clients that go, they were only supposed to live here 3 months and it's been 10 years. It's more often than not that it's not going to be temporary. So just know know if someone at the outset, they don't have good credit, or their friend or family member and they are in a bind, don't expect it to be short term. You just don't. And if you don't want to risk that, then say no. Also, this goes more towards, or to a degree, towards underwriting. When you have lease applications and you reviewing them and you're going through the process and you're vetting, have vetting criteria in place and then adhere to it consistently. Another one is not increasing rent. Not increasing rent does not make you a good landlord. It could make you nice, but does not make you a good landlord. No one that I can see, there's not been any tenant that goes, my landlord is so swell for not ever raising my rent in my rent controlled apartment that, you know what, I'm just gonna move when they demand that I move without compensation. That has not ever happened. What happens more often, and probably because I'm an attorney, so these cases come to me if there weren't problems, then no one would come to me. What happens is, again, the market rent is the market rent. And if it's rent controlled, you only get to increase rent as the rent control jurisdiction allows you. The RSO board that's applicable to your area. In California, there's also a state law. So there's varying metrics of which you have a limitation on how much you can raise rent in mostly apartments. So that being said, when you don't raise rent, that doesn't change the fact that all the other expenses are going up. So trash goes up, utilities go up, maintenance goes up, inflation affects everybody. That's why rent control boards have rent increases, because they account for inflation as well in those calculations. But when you don't raise rent, you're only setting yourself back as a landlord, and you only set yourself up to fail in the future when you are mad at yourself that you didn't raise the rent. And then the tenant is like way behind in the sense that maybe they're way under market. Now, is it possible that units can be under market? Yeah, once you move someone in, you move them in at the rent you move them in, but maybe rents go up drastically higher than what the rent increases are. That's a completely different story. But as a landlord, when you move someone in, there's market rent and then you raise it consistently. Not raising it, that might seem nice and the tenant may appreciate it, but it's not going to come back to you in any form of goodwill or cooperation on the tenant's part. Like, let's say 10 years down the line, you want them to move out and you want someone who has market, or someone willing to pay market rent. Well, if it's a rent controlled building, you can't get the tenant to agree to market rent because it violates the rent control board. The only way you can get market rent for that specific unit is if it becomes vacant and then you release it at market rent. So what ends up happening is the tenant is there, you didn't raise their rent, and worse, maybe you gave them too cheap rent to begin with, and then now you are, 50% behind market. You might be a little bit better off if you had leased at market rent and you had increased rent, as allowed. Now, I'm not talking about COVID, because COVID, there's a lot of restrictions and you couldn't raise rent. So we're not talking about that. That is like now a blip in history. But just in general, if you have this idea that you're going to be a great landlord and not raise rent ever, that's not good landlording, and that's most definitely not good business. And then the last one of the 5 is not putting utilities in tenant's name. So it's very common in houses, or if there's an apartment building and they're sub-metered, that a portion or all of the utilities will go into the tenant's name. And what I've seen is that landlords don't enforce this right away. And so it ends up being either a bill back scenario where that becomes a dispute with the tenant about paying it, or you're paying it and you're not getting the money back from the tenant. So you need to be very, very diligent about making sure the utilities are out of your name and in the tenant's name. The utilities the tenant is responsible for. It's your responsibility to make sure and see that gets through. Reminding the tenant, or before the tenant moves in, notifying the utility company that a tenant is moving in and that you're going to close your billing cycle, or close your bill. Those are 5 things that I feel maybe are obvious, but mostly to me, if you take those 5 into consideration, especially for mom and pop landlords who have a few number of units, and mom and pop landlords are extremely good natured. Society loves mom and pop landlords. They're a good chunk of the housing provider. But as a mom and pop landlord, you want to make sure that you are doing what's also in your best interest, and not setting yourself up to fail down the line. So I hope that was helpful. If you did find that helpful, you might find my video on not doing favors with real estate, which actually expands on point number 1 more. So I will link that. And then you might also like my video on the landlord-tenant dynamic, which I will also link that. Some are up here or at the end screen. But thank you for checking in. If you would be so inclined, you can sign up for the newsletter that I send out weekly, which has a lot of landlord tips and it has a lot of news relevant to landlords that comes out every Sunday. That is also linked below. Thank you.